Hey there. Okay, this week in the Bible study, we went over the character of Sarah. We were in Genesis chapter 12, 16, 17, 18, and 21. I just want to do this recap to go over some of the major key points that we hit in talking about Sarah. Now, most people know the story of Sarah. They know Abraham and Sarah could not have children, and that she was very, very old when God finally blessed her with a child. But there's so much of this story that I want to unpack, and I feel like if you just read it, you can miss over so many powerful points. So I just want to touch on some points that we went over. We talked about in Genesis chapter 12 how faithful she is and such a submissive wife that she leaves everything and follows Abram and follows God when they leave, because there's a famine, they leave and they go to Egypt. We find out that Sarah was very, very beautiful and pleasing to the eye, to the point where Abram asked her when they got to Egypt to please tell people that you are my sister, otherwise they will kill me because your beauty. They will want to take you for their own and they will kill me. But if you tell them that you're my sister, they will, love me because of you. And so we really talked about the submission in that. Me personally, I thought that would be very hard to put myself in those shoes. And I thought about like, oh my gosh, if my husband did that to me. But a lot of people didn't know that she technically was his sister. She was his wife and his half sister. So let's go back to Genesis, right? We're thinking the beginning of times. We had to create a world somehow. So just ponder on that for a minute. So not only was she his wife, she was also his half sister. So he just asked her to say, please say that you're my sister. Pharaoh takes her into his house and they get all these riches and all these things until the Lord puts a plague on the house and Pharaoh finds out that Abram lied and sends them away. So now we find them, they have been sent away and they have established on this land that God promised them. And now they are old. Sarah, I believe, is in her 80s, Abram's in his 90s, and they are without child. So what does Sarah do? And at this point, she's not technically Sarah yet. Her name is Sarai, Sarai. And so what she decides to do in this time is she takes her maidservant, Hagar, and she tells Abram to sleep with her maidservant, Hagar, so that they can have a child. They know that a promise has already been made from God that through Abram was going to come the promise of a child. And so we really talked about that and unpacked that. Like, one, how many times have we done that as women when we are supposed to be waiting on God and listening to God and honoring God, but we choose to take matters into our own hands and do it ourselves? And I'm sure so many of us can relate, because waiting on God is probably the hardest thing to do. But this story is so impactful of the power of waiting on God and being submissive and listening for God. Because what happens is Sarah, decides not to wait on God, and she takes matters into her own hands, and she has her maidservant Hagar sleep with Abram, and she becomes pregnant. Then Sarai gets so angry because now Hagar's pregnant. Hagar is being mean to Sarah. Sarah then in turn is being super mean to Hagar. And we're going to talk more about this whole jealousy conflict within pregnancy and women in the next 2 weeks when we talk about Rebecca and Leah. But what happens is these two women kind of start feuding, and Sarah starts treating Hagar so mean that Hagar literally runs. And then she has the nerve to turn around and point the finger at Abram and say, this is your fault. This is your fault that you did this to me. Can anybody relate? You take matters into your own hands. You don't wait on God. You do something, and it creates so much chaos and havoc in your life because you try to take power and control. And so we talked about this, kind of goes back to 2 weeks ago when we talked about Eve. And the problem that happens is when us as women want power and control, how easily we can slip into sin. Now, I don't know if this was sin in that moment, because it was part of the culture that if you were over the childbearing age and you could not have children, because not being able to have children in that day and time was a disgrace. So it was the culture that if you couldn't have children, that you would give your maidservant to make the family line go along. So I don't know if she actually did anything wrong. She waited so long and then she did this, but then she had the nerve to get mad and treat everybody bad because of it. She was mad at Abram, she was mad at Hagar, and so mean to Hagar that she sent her off running. But here's the thing, how many times in our lives, so it was culture for them to do that, but how many times in our lives can we use this story and be like, just because something is the norm for the culture, does that always mean it's right? Does that always mean it goes along with God's plan? Does that always mean that it's what God wants? Just because it's culture doesn't mean it's right. And so in this story, it was the culture and it was the norm to give your maidservant, but it really affected Sarah and Abram in their relationship, and Hagar went off running. Hagar was not our main character this week, but we really talked about Hagar running away and how so much of that, like, we can't run away from our problems. You cannot always run away from your problems. And how God sent an angel after Hagar and told her, Hagar, why are you running? And we really talked about how that went hand in hand with Eve 2 weeks ago, when Eve was hiding in her guilt and her shame, and God came and said, where are you? God already knows. He already knows where you are. He already knows you're hiding. He already knows your guilt and shame. So now we find this cycle repeating itself with Hagar when she is running from her problems. How many times do we run from our problems instead of running towards God? And she is running away from Sarah. She is running away from her problems. And the angel of the Lord is sent to her and he says, where are you going? What are you doing? And the angel of the Lord tells Hagar, go back. I think that's very profound, because I think that's God telling us sometimes you need to face your problems. You cannot run away from everything. And sometimes the Lord will call you to go back and face your problems. So that was very huge. Okay. Then we go on to chapter 17. And this is where, so Hagar is pregnant. And then this is where Abram and Sarah, find out that they are going to have a child. God makes a covenant with Abram, and he tells him exactly how this is going to go. He tells him, you are going to have a child with Sarah. I will bless this child. The promise will be with this child, and I want you to name him Isaac. And Abram falls face down and laughs. Okay? Then a few verses later, we find out that Sarah finds out that she is going to have a child. And she in turn laughs. She hears that God is going to have a child, and she is going to have a child within a year. And Sarah laughs. Sarai, at this point, she laughs. And if you don't know this, the name Isaac, so their son Isaac, that God said, you will have a child within a year, and you will name him Isaac. Isaac means laughter. Isaac means he laughs. And this was a key point that we talked about, because Abram laughed at God. Sarah laughed at God. But then God told them to name the child He Laughs, capital H-E. And what that means to me is God laughed. God had the final word. How many times have you laughed at God, or has God told you something, or had a dream or a vision or a plan of your life, and you laughed? And you were like, I'm not qualified. I don't have what it takes. I'm 87 years old. Could God really do this to me, through me? And that's why Sarah laughs. How many times in our lives has God given us a dream, given us a vision, or spoken something over us, and we laugh? I did it. I've told you guys a million times. I heard God say ministry to me 6 years ago, and I laughed and I shook it off, because nowhere in my wildest dreams could I have ever seen myself in ministry. I didn't know how. I didn't know where I would even start. I laughed. And it wasn't until 3 years later that I found myself in the place to start Shine. And now 6 years later, it's not so funny anymore. I'm laughing. And the part I love about this story is after Sarah laughs, God said, why did you laugh? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? I want to say that one more time. When Sarah laughs at God because she thinks, I am old, why would I have a child now? And she laughs at God. God says, why are you laughing? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? And I want you to ask yourself that question. Why are you laughing at God? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? The answer is no. There is nothing impossible with your Lord, your God. And so God asks her, why are you laughing? And this is where I see a cycle once again repeating itself from 2 weeks ago when we talked about Eve, is in her fear and in her guilt and shame that she lied or she laughed, she lied. And she goes, I didn't lie. And God said, yes, you did. And so I really think, and it goes back to the story of Eve. The original sin, the way the enemy attacks women is the same over and over. You see the same cycle. Just like Eve hid in her guilt and in her shame. And God said, where are you? Hagar ran from her problems, hiding in her pain, in her fear, in her shame. And God sent an angel saying, where are you going? And now God is looking right at Sarah and he says, why'd you laugh? And in her guilt and in her shame, in her embarrassment, in her fear, she says, I didn't. She lies right to God. I didn't. And he goes, yeah, you did. Think about that for a second. Do you see this cycle of how sin repeats itself in our life? And it's in our guilt and our shame and our fear, our anxieties and our worriness. The things that we should be going to God with, we're hiding from him. We should not be hiding these natural feelings. We should be taking them to God because we know those feelings, guilt, shame, fear, running from our problems, those aren't of God. Okay? Is there anything too hard for the Lord? This is the last little nugget that I want to touch on, and probably one of my favorite, most powerful parts of this whole story is when God changes their name. So remember, I told you in the beginning of the story, it was Abram and Sarai. And then God changed their name with the covenant to Abraham and Sarah. Okay, and I asked the girls, what other time in our lives do we see a name change with a covenant under God? And it's in marriage. And something really cool, and I didn't even know this, I heard from one of the girls in Bible study that Sar, S-A-R, in Sarah's name was, in those days, it was a possessive. Like kind of like she belonged to Abram. She was his. It was a possessive. But then God came in and he changed it from Abram to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah. The cool, profound thing that I love about this story, one is God never changed another woman's name in the Bible. Sarah was the only woman who he changed his name. Everybody else in the Bible who had a name change, the name was completely changed. Simon, Peter, Paul, Saul. But with Abraham and Sarah, it was a little different. He didn't fully change their name. He took their identity, he took their name, and he added an H to both of them. I want you to hear this really cool thing and hold on to this. H, when you ever hear somebody speak of that letter H, it's a sound. It makes the sound, right? So Abraham, Sarah, it's that like sound of breath. And the coolest thing I ever heard was that sound is also the name of Yahweh. Yahweh. In biblical, in Hebrew, when God says to Moses, I am, in the actual original Hebrew version, it was YW or YHWH, Yahweh. And it makes that sound. It's the sound of breath. It's the sound of a sigh. And so for me, and this is just my opinion, I don't know if this is truth, but this is the way I look at it. I think there's something so powerful and so profound knowing that God added that H, that sound of breath, that sound of life, that sound of Yahweh to their life, to their name, to their identity. He didn't fully change who they were. He just added himself in there to finish the story, to finish the name. And then because of God, but God, he made a promise and a covenant that nations would come through them, that Sarah would be the mother of nations. And here's where we start seeing the 12 tribes of Israel, and that kings would come from her. And that is powerful. And it had nothing to do with who Sarah was. And I mean, she laughed at God. She had nothing to offer. She was almost 90 years old. But it wasn't because of Sarah. It was because of that H, the Yahweh, the God in Sarah, that made all of this stuff come to life. And through her, through that H, through God, through the blessing, came kings of the 12 tribes. One more cool little nugget. When you're reading that story about when God made that covenant with Abram, and I've been talking about this a lot, about spiritual gifts and how God made you who you are on purpose and for purpose. The coolest thing of that is when you read that story and God is making that covenant with Abram, he said, I made you into nations. Made, M-A-D-E, past tense. He didn't say, as of right now, I am going to make you in nations. He said, I made you nations. Predestined, past tense. God made Abraham father of nations before Abraham was even born. I made you. That means that was established and part of the plan well before any of the mistakes, any of the chaos, any of the drama, anything that they could have done, before they laughed at God, before they fell on their face and didn't think that God could do it. And he had to say, is there anything too hard for the Lord? God already knew and predestined. I made nations. I made you for nations. You will be the father of multitude. So I want you to think about that when you're thinking about your life. God made you for something. He may have to add an H. He may have to add a Yahweh. He may have to add a breath of life and something in you to work through you, but you are already made for more, just like Abraham and Sarah. And who knows what's going to come from you. From Sarah, it was Isaac. It was a blessing. It was a promise. She became mother of nations, and she became mother of kings. What is God going to do in you and through you?